Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Mechanics Institute. I'm Laura Shepard, Director of Events, and we're very pleased to welcome you to our program.
This thing is hard for me.
With author Eileen Truax, who is the author of We Build the Wall, How the U.S. Keeps Out Asylum Seekers from Mexico, Central America, and Beyond, and Lauren Markham, author of The Faraway Brothers, Two Young Immigrants and the Making of an American Life. And both of these authors are in conversation with Ian Gordan, managing editor of Mother Jones magazine. So tonight, we're going to be talking about one of the most critical issues of our time: immigration, refugees, the border wall. And tonight, our authors and moderator will share real-life stories of the experiences of the men, women, and children of all ages who actually have crossed the borders and have survived and thrived. Before we begin, I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors today. We're very pleased to welcome the staff and volunteers from Refugee Transitions, a wonderful organization on Market Street that provides the services and the resources for refugees and asylees from over 50 countries. So we're very pleased to welcome Jyoti Gurung and also Julia Glossmeyer from Refugee Transitions. Their brochures and information are on the table on the side, and we hope that you'll go over and pick it up and also perhaps join them in their efforts. Also, we're very pleased to welcome our co-sponsors, City Lights Bookstore and Publishing. We welcome back Peter Maravellis, Program Director, and Ivy Anderson, who's on staff. So thank you so much for providing our books and also collaborating with us on this wonderful program. Now, before we begin, how many of you are new to the Mechanics Institute? Who's never been here? Wonderful. Many. So welcome. Please come back on a Wednesday at noon and take the free tour of the Mechanics Institute. You'll be introduced to our amazing and gorgeous library, which is on the second and third floors. It's a general interest library. We have an international chess club right down the hallway, which offers classes, grandmaster, lecture, tournaments, so many things that are going on in that chess club. Chess for women, chess for all ages and backgrounds and levels. And also our library, by the way, offers book clubs, writer support groups, technology classes, and also our events, which are author events such as these, our Cinema Lit film series on Friday nights, and we have panel discussions on topical issues going on throughout the year. So take the tour, become a member, and become part of our ever-growing cultural family here at 57 Post Street in San Francisco. So now I'd like to introduce our guests. Originally from Mexico, Eileen Truax is a journalist and immigrant currently living in Los Angeles. She contributes regularly to Hoy, Los Angeles, and Unidos, and writes for Latin America publications, including Proceso, El Universal, and Gatopardo. Truax often speaks at colleges and universities about the Dreamer movement and about immigration. Lauren Markham's essays, fiction, and journalism has appeared in outlets such as VQR, where she's a contributing editor, Harper's, TheNewYorker.com, The Guardian, The New Republic, Guernica, Vice, Mother Jones, Orion, The Atlantic, California Sunday, and other publications. In addition to writing, she works at a high school for immigrant youth in the Bay Area and teaches writing at the Ashland University MFA in Writing program. Also in the Bay Area at Left Margin Lit and University of San Francisco. So please welcome Eileen Truax, Lauren Markham, and Ian Gordan, managing editor of Mother Jones, for our program.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for coming tonight and joining us. I'm so excited to be with these two wonderful observers, reporters, writers, whose works in front of us are just incredible pieces of journalism and pieces of writing. I just want to jump right in, so you guys ready? Yeah. Great. So for starters, these books, you started writing these books a while ago, pre-Trump. So I'm interested, when you first started out, Eileen, why don't you go first? What did you set out to do or say or show in that beginning process? Were you trying to kind of communicate about immigration in America at that point?
Yes. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited for being here, and thank you for coming. The process, especially for this book, was interesting. I've been an immigration reporter for 15 years now here in the U.S., and for 7 years, the first 7 years, I worked as a reporter for La Opinión, which is the largest Spanish newspaper in the country. And when you cover immigration for a daily, as a bit, you get familiar with so many stories, but most of them are not breaking. And you know that when you're working in a newspaper, you need to have those breaking stories, although you have a lot of more stories that you feel that it's worth to tell, but you don't have the space and sometimes not the time to publish. Among those stories not told, I found that when people are coming to ask for asylum in the US, the media in general, but especially the media who covers the subject in their countries of origin, cover the transit. We have heard and read and see a lot about the Beast, the train that crosses from Central America through Mexico. We have seen images of people in little boats trying to make it to a coast, or people crossing the desert. We put a lot of focus in the transit process. But once the people arrive in the country, and especially if they make it, and if they start living in their countries, we forget about them. That happens in the countries of origin and also happens with us. Once the person arrives, sometimes we see them, right now we are seeing them in the detention center. They are looking for a legal process, but 2 years later, we forget about them. So to me, particularly the people asking for asylum is people that is living a very hard time while waiting for their legal situation to be fixed. And even after that, because most of the people asking for asylum are here not to look for a better life, but to keep living, to save their lives. And they're coming with a lot of trauma. Many of them are coming just with the clothes in their bags, and they don't speak the language. And they didn't want to come. They have to come. And I decided to tell these stories and what happens after they cross the border to portray what are we as a society doing with these people, or not doing with these people, once they are living among us.
Well, I'm sort of digesting all that. I will say, I actually thought that I completely agree. I think with immigration, two things happen. We tend to tell the stories about the journey itself, and we tend to think of immigration as this moment that happens right when someone's stepping across that like bright red line of the border, right? It's like as if immigration is something that happens at the border, but in fact it happens long before in all of the geopolitical, is something weird happening? You can hear me? Okay. All the geopolitical factors that are pushing people out of their homes, and all of the factors that people are considering when they're making the choice, and then sometimes there's not much choice in the matter at all to leave their homes. And then after they cross the border, it's not just the circumstances of stepping across or swimming across or floating across the border and not just being in detention, but it's like that long process of legal limbo, of trying to find a lawyer, or of living a long life in the shadows. So that was really important to me, to sort of tell the story long before and long after the immigration moment. But I will also say that just on the Trump election, like I thought my book was done in November of 2016. I was like, all right, I was already to send it off, and then all of a sudden the election happened. And I realized that in addition to sort of processing all the implication of the election, I realized that it was actually inappropriate and kind of unfair to not include as much as I did not want to write about the election in my book. It was sort of unfair not to, because that had such implications for the young men. I write about various characters, but my book is focused on two identical twin brothers who leave El Salvador because of issues related to gang violence, and their story, their family story back in El Salvador, their older brother, who is undocumented here in the United States, were deeply and are deeply affected by the election and the kind of consequences and fallout from the election. So turned out I had to write about the election, and I had to write about Trump.
Which is kind of a perfect segue into my next question, which is how the Trump administration has kind of affected the way you view your work as immigration reporters.
I have a lot of work. It's been the 2 first months, I mean, the month after the election, but especially after the new administration started, it was crazy. Because I write for some media in the US, but mostly I write for Latin America and Spain media. And everyone wanted a story about Trump. And it was crazy. Radio stations will call me. It was crazy. And I was like, what? The guy hasn't done anything. I mean, things are exactly the same like the last day of the Obama's administration. What's going on? So it's been very noisy. And I think that if something good has come out of all of this, is that people now are talking about immigration. Thank you. Because I've been a reporter for 15 years, and trust me, it's hard. I mean, I'm Latina, and I write about immigration. It's really hard to put your work out because that's not newsworthy for many people. And we don't like to think or to talk about that unless there's a huge threat or something that shakes us to the core, which is what happened with the Trump administration. I believe that at the moment of the Muslim ban, that was the moment where everyone was shaken, and it's like, okay, we have to do something, and we did it. I'm very happy. But I would tell you that the way I work hasn't changed. What I have now is more visibility, which I appreciate. But I'm also concerned because, as I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes the news cycle, and especially with the internet and social media, goes really fast. So something goes to the peak, and you know that next week we're going to be talking about other thing. Fortunately for Lauren and me, this administration is decided to promote our books, saying a new thing every week. So it's a little bit different. But the truth is that what we are seeing now is not new in terms of policy. Trump has not created anything new. He has not new money for Border Patrol. He's planning on expanding detention centers, but they are not expanded yet. We will not have a physical wall in the border. So basically, he hasn't changed anything. He's just working and operating on the system that we had previously, that we have had for a very long year. He's using this system in a very cruel way. And that's why everybody's looking at it. And he's being very public about it. He's detaining a lot of people, but he's not deporting more people than Barack Obama. And we were not this outraged when Barack Obama was deporting people. So to me, we have to be very careful because sometimes I feel that the perception is that all of this came with Trump. And we might think that if the Trump administration finishes, all of this is going to finish. And that's not true. This is not about who is in the government, but about how the system is working. Of course, yes, we have to fix a lot of things in this November. But I also think that we have to think in the mid and the long term, looking for a change in the way we see ourselves towards the world, in terms of who do we receive and how do we receive them. I can talk a little bit more about that later, but those are the main changes. I'm trying to focus on something that is not so immediate, but something that I think is important to take a look for a long time.
Well, at the very least, I'm delighted to hear that Sarah Huckabee Sanders is working as your publicist now. That's getting some good, honest work out of her. You know, Lauren, I'm wondering how you deal with this issue that Eileen was just mentioning, kind of like how do you contextualize this story, particularly with regard to Barack Obama's immigration legacy? How do you kind of contextualize the immigration story where we're at now without kind of resorting to a sort of whataboutism? You know, what about Obama?
Right. Yeah, I mean, so I tend to like to write longer stories, and I think that more space on the page allows you to have more, and that's why it was sort of really delightful and miserable at the same time to write a book, in the sense that there was like plenty of room to sort of go down those historical wormholes and make sure that we're holding the past accountable for the present, right? I mean, the fact is, previous administrations, including Barack Obama, created the perfect scaffolding on which to build these kind of current regimes. And just a quick add-on to what Eileen was saying. I think you know, the challenge of journalists is to both hold the past accountable and not just sort of join the fray of, isn't it so horrible what's happening now? Because of course it is horrible, and yet it's not actually all that new. It's just, it's a mutated version of what already existed. How do you sustain that interest? Because unfortunately we as a culture tend to follow the shiny things. And I know I was just last night in Houston at an event with a bunch of immigration attorneys, and they were talking about like family separation happens, and they get a gajillion people being like, we want to volunteer, we want to be lawyers for you, we want to do this, we want to do that. And then family separation sort of ends and people kind of fizzle out. And I know Refugee Transitions is here. They're an amazing organization. Full disclosure, I used to work for them, but I love them. And I know like after the election, right, you guys got bombarded with volunteers. Like we at Oakland International, where I work, got bombarded with volunteers. And then that starts to peter out. So how do we, kind of our job as journalists seems to me to be to like keep telling the stories, not just in the moment of the kind of family separation horror insanity, but like the sort of maybe more quotidian horrors and challenges that are happening along the way that allow us to get to that point. And you know, as a journalist, I feel like I felt the inverse, that family separation happened, and like I got all these calls for like Vogue, like Cosmo, like all these magazines are like, we need a story about family separation, and you're like, what? You know, and that's both exciting, like, yay, a family separation story should be in Vogue. I did not write the story, but like, or I didn't have one for them. But at the same time, like, how do we keep the interest? How do we sustain the focus and the attention? And I'm not actually sure I have the greatest answer to that, besides just like keep writing the stories, keep researching the stories, and kind of keep watching, you know, keep watching what's happening.
No, and I think, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think something that we also have to keep doing is to follow up on the stories that we already covered. This used to happen 10, 15 years ago in journalism, because you would have newsrooms where journalists would have beats, would cover beats, so you become a specialist in certain subject, and you could talk about that with with perspective, with background, giving context to readers. My concern now is that, especially with immigration, who previously was not covered by some media, New York Times and Washington Post are hiring like 10 immigration reporters right now. I was like, yes. Okay, that's very good, but the truth is that they didn't have one before. How is that possible? Right. I mean, you needed someone who knew this stuff in your newsroom. And by the way, if they're a minority, and by the way, if they're Latino, and if they're a woman, that would be great, but that's not happening. Yeah. But to me, that's the thing, that right now everything is so new, and I don't know how to say this to make it sound good, but you can see very young reporters reporting for TV, discovering the immigration the immigrant detention centers or the shelters for children. And they are, you know, this is a scandal. And we're like, oh my God, this story has been told for a very long time, but no one was paying attention. So I would really love to have these young and sometimes not so young reporters who are assigned to the beat to follow up on the stories, because they do have a chance. Most of the newsroom don't have a chance anymore because they are now very little. Most of us are freelancers. You don't have a newsroom but a Starbucks. And so it's hard to follow up the stories. But I'm sure that you all remember, and well, the Book of Lauren talks about it, this wave of unaccompanied minors came in 2014. It was everywhere. Where are those kids now? Lauren will tell you. But no one else says that. How come we were paying so much attention to these children coming by themselves to this country, and they are still here, and we don't have an idea what's happening to them? I can't believe we don't do that. So to me, telling those stories and keep telling those stories and going back to them, it's the way to show that this is not something that happened once, that is something happening all the time, that these kids are sitting in the school next to our kids, they're not our neighbors, that you know where they are. So let's acknowledge that.
You know, and that kind of storytelling really plays to both of your strengths. I mean, both of you really rely on kind of intimate, deeply reported stories of individuals. I mean, your books are made up of beautiful, whole characters. You know, these people who have full lives and, you know, are not, you know, and Lauren and I often talk about this, as so many immigration stories are, you know, the perfect model immigrant or the criminal immigrant, and as if there's no in between. People aren't whole. I wonder, kind of, what the two of you think is the main value of telling those sorts of stories, and also on the other side of that, what sort of limitations are there to telling larger stories about immigration through the lens of individuals?
I mean, you know, stories are sort of like humanity's connective tissues. We respond to stories. We can, I think, story is a prism through which we can understand policy and its implications. Story just helps us kind of connect with the matter at hand. I will also say that I feel like as a reader and as a writer, I can easily get stuck. And actually, this book was such a delight to read because it did something different. But I can really get stuck and sort of, this sounds so flip, but like a little bit bored by this trope of like, when so-and-so left his home at the age of XYZ, you know, in XYZ place, like he never would have imagined that. Or like there's this like really kind of cookie cutter narrative that I have written. I think probably all of us have written this story because it's, the, you know, a journey narrative is also like kind of it's like an archetypal story form. And yet it's like how, I think to your question about limitations, like how do we write something that feels fresh so that our eyes aren't just glazing over without sort of succumbing to kind of a cult of the new, like needing something to be kind of like new and snazzy. Archetypes are archetypes for a reason, but I think it's hard to keep people interested in immigration because in certain ways we keep telling what seems like a similar story over and over again because so many of the stories are similar. So I think it's a little bit of a trap.
Yes, I think that's the main challenge, and also that immigration, because of the way we cover the subject, it's always linked to problem. We even talk about fixing the immigration problem. I mean, we don't even ask ourselves if this is a problem or not. We take for granted that that's a problem and we have to fix that. And I think that's hard for us, makes it hard for us, because if you have a story about an immigrant, and I'm not talking about the successful immigrant who started selling oranges and now has a restaurant, no, not that one, but you have immigrants that in the simple fact of going to work, or in the case of dreamers, going to school, then going to work, then helping their families during the weekend and having a girlfriend, the challenge to live that life when you don't have documents means everything. It's a totally different story than the regular story that you would have with someone who has no legal restrictions. And that's a story that is worth to tell. And that's not the story of a victim, because my experience with immigrants, and especially with dreamers, the generation of dreamers, is that they are doing everything but seeing themselves as victims. And that part, I love it. So if you are telling a story where no one is hitting no one is in jail, no one is deported, it looks like that's not a story that is worth to tell. But that's an immigration story happening here next to us, and we have to tell them. So to me, that's the challenge, how to tell the story when there's no crisis, when there's no problem, and you still have to tell the story. In the case of We Built the Wall, most of the stories start with that news-breaking line, because these are people, in most of the cases, who were threatened in Mexico or Central America. Most of my cases are from Mexico, specifically for the Juarez, El Paso area, people who lived in Juarez and were victims of the organized crime, sometimes the government itself, and had to flee and now are living in Texas or other states. So yes, I have that part related to the violence and the newsworthy subject, but I also tell you how they have overcome all of those situations in recent years, living here in the US. And you know, it's so hard because for some of them, every day, it's like a little Everest, because you achieve something that is really hard. To get a job when you don't have documents, to be able to pay your tuition when you don't have a grant, or you don't have the financial support. Those little details that an undocumented person has to think about and live with every single day. And they cannot work, and they cannot receive money for school, and they cannot drive, but they are working and going to school and graduating with honors, and they're driving. How are they doing that? That's a story that is worth to tell. So to respond to your question, I think that in the process to choose what story to tell and why to choose a story, I think that I selected those that reflect better the whole process that an immigrant has to, an immigrant and an exiled person has to go through when they arrive in the US. Not only, as Lauren mentioned, the moment in the border, and also some of these stories I felt that help very well to be the little bus that is transporting data and facts, hard facts, you know, because sometimes, especially when we're seeing reports from Washington, immigrants are numbers. We are all familiar with the 11 million undocumented, 2 million dreamers, 8,000. Those are numbers, but it's very hard to relate that to faces. So these stories are the excuse to tell you, these are people like yourself, and there are 11 million, by the way.
Not 26 million or whatever the new report
yeah.
said.
No. Maybe one just thing I can add. I was just in El Salvador and Mexico, and one of the things that made such an impression, and that was also so upsetting about being there is like, a lot of the things that I was seeing was the same things that I was seeing 2 years ago and 4 years ago and 6 years ago. And so it follows that we're reading and writing a lot of really similar stories, because when in the case of El Salvador, like the violence operates in a really similar fashion. People are leaving for really similar reasons. The stories are horrific and have a lot of resonance among one another, even though everyone, of course, has their separate story. So on the one hand, we need to be telling the stories that are happening, and we also need, I found myself when I came back being like, I went because someone wanted me, of course, to write about family separation, and I found myself sort of with all all of these different story ideas of looking at the issue from other angles. Whether I'll ever write any of these stories, I don't know, but I found myself sort of stretching my brain. It actually came relatively naturally of like, okay, yeah, family separation, but what about this other thing? Like, what about how deportation, and now I'm gonna tell you, I saw my story ideas. What about, yeah, if you commission me, I will, yeah. But, you know, what about how deportation is in fact a regime of family separation, you know, and that's a longstanding regime? Or what about this factor? What about this or this other? And I think that that is part of the way, and that's why beats are so important, right? That we know that we're writing about things again and again, and we're revisiting the same places and the same sort of dynamics so that we can have fresh eyes to other perspectives and sort of other like other narratives that help illuminate the larger narrative question problem of migration. I don't mean problem of migration, but like the problem of what to do. Yeah.
One of the things you just said kind of reminded me, you know, both of you are expert, you are an expert in what's going on in Mexico in many ways, right? And you are an expert, Lauren, in what's going on in El Salvador. You spent a lot of time there and done a lot of reporting from there. And I wonder how you manage in your writing to kind of complicate this larger story by talking about what's happening in sending countries, because that's something that often, it's sending countries, so in Mexico, in Central America, it's something that's often very lightly hit upon in a news story. You know, there's violence in Central America or violence in Juarez. And I wonder, you know, what techniques or what have you found effective? How have you kind of effectively worked in some of that context and history without kind of overburdening a reader who maybe doesn't have any of that background and doesn't know a lot about kind of the history of violence or, you know, state failure in those places?
Well, that's hard. And actually, there's the beginning of one chapter in this book that I feel is too hard because I talk about the story of the construction of the notion of the border between Mexico and the US, which is a construction, a political construction, and how it started, because it started in Juarez, El Paso. So basically, I had to talk about that, and it was a little hard. For this particular book, a research that I found, and I used it twice, is that my character, the person who I was following here in the US who had to flee Mexico, told me the story of their family. And by telling the story of their family, they were also telling the story of the country in terms of political and social environment. So, for example, one of the characters who had to leave El Valle de Juarez because he was a regidor, which would be something similar to a council member. There were 6 of them, and the organized crime started killing them. They killed 1, they killed 2, and everyone knew that this person was the next one. So he had to flee. They made the decision in 2 days, and he was here in the US. And at the moment that I talked to him, he had spent 2 years in the US, and he still cried and cried, saying that he didn't want to come. But when he talked me about his family, his father was from the state of Michoacan, and they had to migrate to Chihuahua, to Juarez, because of the lack of jobs, because of certain policies that were applied, economic policies applied in the south of Mexico. So by telling the story of the family, I was able to point to certain key moments in the story of the country that I feel led to the situation for some of these people. The fact that we had NAFTA, and part of the NAFTA included the ability to install these factories in the border, and Mexico was supposed to provide the workers, and that changed a lot around the country, the way people were related to their fields, to their hometowns. So that's the research that I used to tell the story. And also, I did very, very long interviews. I have one interview that lasts 5 hours. It was very hard to decide what to leave in the book, but I decided to leave many of the testimonies that say how the Mexican state failed them, failed in protecting them, failed in paying attention to what was happening in the region, because, you know, Mexico is a really big country, and it's very centralized, so it's hard that something happening in a little town would make it to the news or would get the attention from the government. So I try to put that in their own words every time I talk about the failed state that is Mexico. It's because of their words and their testimony. That was the particularity for this book. I think in other works I use other resources, but here it was their own story, because that explains why they're here.
Yeah, I guess I would just, yeah, the interviews and the long interviews and the sort of spending time with people was really critical. And it's one, and this is sort of the old like show don't tell adage of writing, right? Which is that it's one thing to say, and this is, you know, can be more newspapery journalism to say, you know, people are afraid in El Salvador for their lives, or people are fleeing for their lives, which is true in large part. And it's another thing to sort of show and try to render what that looks like and feels like to individual people. And I think that sometimes the more subtle details are actually the more powerful ones. So, you know, the fact that the young men and their family, when I was writing about them, I'd say, you know, and when I was interviewing them, it's like, okay, well, tell me about your town. I visited their town, but tell me about your town. How is it different from what it used to be? And it's like, oh yeah, well, before, like, the lady would be selling pupusas late at night and people would be hanging out at the square, and like, now no one's out after dark. Now no one's out after dark. So it's like, how can I, that's just a super small example times, you know, the whole book of how do you bring to life on the page the fact that there was a town where people used to be out and doing things in this small, pretty poor rural town in El Salvador, and now, like, it's lights out kind of self-imposed curfew because it's not safe there anymore, you know? And how do you tell the individual, how do you kind of try to render the experience of fear in an individual person's body? One of the things that was really fascinating to me and kind of an epiphany a little bit was how much rumors play into people's reasons for fleeing or people's decisions to flee, that someone says that someone else said that they were going to kill them, right? Or they got a phone call or they got a message, which if I just got a random text that said, if you don't give me $500, I'm gonna kill you, like that would be alarming, but I wouldn't, and I would probably contact the authorities, something you really can't do in most parts of El Salvador. It would freak me out, but I wouldn't actually give so much credibility that someone was actually going to kill me for $500. Whereas there, like the young men, like I finally understood, they get that text message and like you're not going to sit around and wait to see if it's a scam or not, you know, like you've seen enough violence around you. So that was sort of trying, like those kind of deep interviews and trying to render the experiences of individual people. So we're not just talking about like statistics and we're not just telling what's happening, but we're really like showing and feeling it.
So, you know, showing and feeling requires a lot of deep reporting.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you navigate that level of reporting when you're often dealing with subjects who have quite a bit of trauma in their lives and their backgrounds. And how do you go about doing that in an ethical way, you know, without kind of making this an extractive relationship or more extractive than a typical journalism interaction is.
Right. Yeah, that's such a good question, and that's something I think about all the time. You know, I started out more in like a social work capacity, so you know, I'm a human being first and a reporter second, and I've definitely, you know, I make decisions. I'm not chasing the story first and foremost, and I'm checking I really do try to check myself along the way to make sure that I'm not just trying to get something. I mean, really the answer is you have to build trust with people, but it's not just about building trust, it's actually about earning and deserving trust. If I am trying to make someone trust me, I am constantly checking myself to make sure that I am actually trustworthy, that I'm not making promises that I can't keep, or I'm not really making any promises at all. If I say, oh, I'll keep you anonymous, I mean that. That if I say, oh, there won't be any photographs of you, that I can really promise that and make sure the photographer like isn't coming around. But also more than that like I do feel as though if they feel comfortable, I'm not pushing them, and if they do feel comfortable to tell me their story, that I feel like I'm going to work my butt off to feel as to make them feel as though I did their story justice, and that's really just like a constant process of kind of gut checking.
Well, yes, I agree with that. That's the way you have to approach to people. You have to care about people in order to have them willing to tell their stories. But also, I think it's important how long do you spend with them, not only in order to get the story, but to understand them and the reasons, what they're carrying with them, because when you are writing about them, you are writing about a whole situation. This is, to me, the story of one character is just to show what's happening with the whole community. So it's not only saying that this happened to this person, this happened to this person who is part of this community that is living in this situation because in this country happened this. So you have to spend a lot of time with that person in order to get to all those layers. As I mentioned, I used to be a newspaper reporter daily. So when you do that, you go speak with a person and you never see them again. In this case, you have to go back and go back. In my case, well, maybe it was easier because you were traveling to El Salvador. I was traveling just to El Paso, Juarez. But at some point, I decided to spend the New Year Eve when one of this family in the Traux, in the desert, just to understand the absence of the 4 siblings that were killed by the cartels. And that helped me, I think, to build a scene in this family. The New Year is arriving. The mother, 70-something years, is there, and not her children. And they are away from their hometown. They had to come to the U.S., and the detail that, to me, is speaking that story is that this family used to be bakers in their hometown. They had bakeries. They liked to, work in the oven in a very artisan way. They were doing bread, and while living in Texas, in El Paso, this person was working for $8 an hour in the bakery of a supermarket. So that day, they brought rosca de reyes, a traditional bread in Mexico, that he did for his family the way he used to do it back in the town. To me, that was so strong. I was like, oh my God, this bread is the symbol of everything that this family has gone through. But that was my 4th interview with them, and I was spending New Year's Eve with them. Otherwise, I couldn't really understand how important it was for them not to be able to bake their own bread, because they were looking for asylum in the U.S.
And living in a trailer.
Living in a trailer. So living in a trailer in a town that is just across the border from their hometown. If you are not able to go back, you're going to have a story, but you're not going to understand why these people are living these lives. And that requires time, and of course you get related to them. I mean, there's no way that you talk 4 times to someone and you don't get close to these people. So, well, that's the way to do it. If you want to do it fast, if you want to do it because you have to, it will never result.
I mean, persistence is obviously so important. I promised Lauren that I would ask a process-related question because she has some students here. And I wonder, kind of, when you're, kind of laying out the groundwork for a work like these, how do you conceptualize the research? How do you go about actually researching and preparing all of that background material? And then also, and this is a question that I always ask people who've written books, because it's not, the answer is really different depending on the writer. How do you go about corroborating the facts and actually fact-checking that work, especially when you're dealing with the personal stories of so many different people. It's really hard to, some of these are based on memories. It can be really difficult to track down, you know, the whatever capital T truth is, or the lowercase t truth.
Well, it's funny because I'm like, ooh, erase that question. My process was so messy and ugly. I don't want to answer this one. I'm just kidding.
In a perfect world, Lauren.
In a perfect world, what would my, I'm not writing another book, but I want to write one just because I know all the mistakes I made the first time. I think where I started in my book, you know, it is a journey narrative, and so where I started in my book was actually filling in the gaps of the young men who I was, of the story of the young men who I was writing about and their family. And so that helped because there was an actual chronology, and I met them in Oakland, California in February, I can't remember, it's January, February of 2000 in the book, of 2014. They crossed the border in August of 2013, and so there was this whole 16 and a half, or almost 17 years, right, that I didn't know them. And so there was an actual chronology to round out, and there were some actual questions I had. Everything from as vague of like, what was your childhood like, to like, when did you leave and why? What was the weather like on that day? You know, everything from the sort of big conceptual philosophical questions down to the kind of factual questions that punctuated their experiences. So that gave me somewhere to start. But I also know that the first time I went down to El Salvador, it wasn't clear to me that I could go to their town, and it wasn't clear to me, and in retrospect, like, it was completely fine to go to their town, but I didn't want to get them in trouble. I didn't, the kind of anatomy of the violence and how it functions down there and in their particular area wasn't clear to me. And so I went down to El Salvador for 3 weeks, and I had like a journalism fellowship from the same, Ian helped me get this great journalism fellowship from the French American Foundation to go down and write a story on, now I can't even remember what I was writing about. I mean, unaccompanied minors, but I can't remember specifically what I was writing about. But so I had a little bit of money that allowed me to like get a plane ticket and stay there for a couple weeks, and it helped to, I needed to like I'd been to El Salvador a bunch of times, but not in many years, and I needed to kind of understand more of the history, more of the kind of like current events, but not just the like, what are the current events of El Salvador, but what was really like the lived experiences of people, and what was just the atmosphere, what were the preoccupying questions, what were the sort of political figures at the moment, and that was a harder thing to start on. So I actually wrote while writing the book and while working at the school where I work, I did write a bunch of stories like for magazines. And at the time, on the one hand, looking back, that was kind of a bad idea because I was just doing too much and it was a little bit all over the place. But actually having these narrower points of focus, like, okay, I could fill out the journey of the students, but these narrower points of focus, like I wrote a profile on the mayor of San Salvador, and I wrote about girls, the experience of girl gangsters in El Salvador. And I wrote about this and I wrote about that. And as much as that took out a lot of time from the book, it helped me like have a clearer focus. So I wasn't just showing up in El Salvador being like, I'd like to write a book about this place, you know. It helped me narrow my focus, which then got me a lot more information and helped me understand things a little bit better and yeah, like narrowed the question. Because I think it's really hard just to be like, so again, I wasn't completely new to El Salvador, but it's a little bit hard to start with this really sweeping question.
Yes, well, in my case, for this particular book, many of the cases that I portray there were well-known cases in Mexico, because these were people who went through very cruel situations that the local media would cover, and even some media in the US, Melissa Del Bosque, today we tweeted about her, but Melissa Del Bosque is a reporter in Texas, and I think that she's the only one who dared to cross to El Valle de Juarez in a moment where the drug cartels were fighting for the plaza, like they say, for the place. And she covered some of these stories. So I had those publications to contrast some of my, dates and exactly where the threats were coming, if there was a authority involved or not, things like that. for this book, but also for much of my reporting, I like to contact lawyers and lawyer organizations. Attorneys normally have a lot of cases, and no one asks them about them. And when you are constantly in touch with them, I'm even in Facebook groups of lawyers, and I receive bulletins. Of course, sometimes I understand just half because this legal language, but it's very easy to have confirmation on what the person says if the case is already in a court or if there's a pro bono lawyer helping, and that was the case of We Build a Wall. One of my characters is Carlos Spector, who is a pro bono lawyer helping these people in these cases, so I had access to the whole file. That's how I could recreate some scenes and to corroborate that they were saying that. Another thing that I did there, because they were coming from the same town, they knew each other. So when I was interviewing one person, he would tell me the story of the other one because it was happening at the same time. Even if they didn't know each other well, back then, they knew what was happening with the other person, so you have the chance to cross information. It's hard because if someone tells you that they were raped or they were, I don't know, violent situations that are hard for them to share, you cannot say, can you prove it, right? So that's why many of those cases I try to approach through a way that already has a little bit of information, so I have a thread to pull. Before this book, I published a book about dreamers, and in that case, it was fantastic because all I had to do was to approach to one of them, and if I connected to them, he would connect me to another one and to another one. And you know, after a few days, I would be in the middle of a meeting of this organization, and there you can feel what's happening, and you don't need files to corroborate anything, you're just there. But again, it requires time. When you're telling human stories about vulnerable people, you cannot have the facts just by talking to the person on the phone.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've got to the moment where we're going to take some questions from the audience. Laura, you want to go ahead? If you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll get you a mic.
Hi, thank you. Well, I wonder if you could each give a brief summary of your books.
Oh,
Yeah, sure.
Where you would tell us what the main thrust and what your goal is. Not, you know, you can tell a teeny bit about one or another stories, but about the larger issue that you're especially focused on in each of your books. Thanks.
Do you want to start?
we should have started. Well, We Build a Wall is, of course, the title refers not the physical wall, but the idea of, that's the book, the idea of the way that we have built a legal bureaucratic wall for people to come to the country, and the way we have been selective to allow these people to come in the country or not, depending on the political moment and the economic moment. So I have different stories of people who has come to the US looking for asylum, most of them, or refuge, but asylum, most of them, they come to the country, they present themselves with the Border Patrol in the border, and the legal process here and in many countries is that you take that person to a detention center, then they are going to have an interview, and someone, an agent or sometimes a judge there, in a few hours or days, they are going to decide if this person qualifies or not to start the asylum process. And in most cases, if that person doesn't have a when they have committed crimes before?
A record.
A criminal record. Or if, I mean, if they're clear, they can wait for the process to go on while they stay legally in the country. The problem here, I mean, that sounds great. The problem here is that we are following that process in a very uneven way. So sometimes someone would come and we would receive them, and 1 week later they would be in one city with people that they know installed. Of course, the very known case is the case of the Cuban people. You know, they came here and the process is really fast and they are allowed to stay. But also people looking for refuge coming from different countries are receiving different treatment depending on the relation that the US have with those countries. So right now, if you are coming from Venezuela or from Syria looking for asylum, the chances that you get the asylum approved are up to 70%, 75%. Right now, if you're coming from Honduras, the chances are 11%. If you're coming from El Salvador, it's 8%. If you're coming from Mexico, it's 2%. And you can present the same evidence, 2% Mexico. You can present the same evidence, the same facts. You can prove that you were threatened. But because a country like Venezuela or like Syria are not allies with the US, you would consider that that country is not safe for that person, and you would receive it. And at the moment you give the asylum or not, you are making a political statement. Of course, we have a trade agreement with Mexico to receive people coming from Mexico as people receiving asylum would be accepting that Mexico is not a democratic country. And then why are we making deals with them? So we are not receiving people coming from Mexico. So my cases are people coming from Central America and Mexico who are part of this small percentage and the way they deal with this. And just to give you a brief example, I have the case of one man that was kidnapped twice in his hometown in Torreón, Mexico, very dangerous place till now. And he presented himself asking for asylum with evidence in the border. At the moment I interviewed him in the Eloy Detention Center, he had spent 1.5 years waiting to see a judge to evaluate the case. At the end, he spent 22 months there. And just to tell you, not to alarm you, but, and this is mentioned in both of our books, I was very glad when I discovered that these detention centers are operating. They're private companies, and we are giving them a budget every year. So these people are detained for 2 years while trying to save their life with our tax money. And that's the book about.
One of the things I love about your book, I'll explain mine in a second, but how you talk about asylees and the asylum process as sort of like a political, that a migrant and an asylum seeker is sort of a political pawn between countries. It's such a upsetting notion and such a true fact. My book, The Faraway Brothers, it's about two identical twin brothers, and they are born and kind of, they're born in the wake of the Civil War to an agrarian family, really poor family in rural El Salvador, and they're born in the wake of the war, and they come of age in El Salvador in tandem with the rise of the gangs. And so as they're kind of coming into adolescence, gangs start coming into their town. And they're identical, and one of the brothers ends up on the wrong side of kind of the wrong guy in his town and has to leave pretty suddenly because he's afraid he's going to be killed. So he leaves, and the story sort of follows their upbringing, follows his flight, and soon after the family realizes that because twin number one looks just like his twin brother, he also has to leave. So they sort of take separate journeys through Mexico. They meet up in Mexico City and go the rest of the way into the United States. They are, unbeknownst to them, because people don't realize, we don't see ourselves as part of geopolitical phenomena, right? When we're living our lives, we just aren't living our lives. But they were part of this sort of surge in 2000. They came in 2013. But the surge of unaccompanied minors that in fact had been surging since 2011. I always like to give Ian a high five for covering that story early on. And so they're part of this surge. They end up crossing into the desert. I won't give you all the details of their story, but they get apprehended, detained, and they're released temporarily into the custody of their brother while while trying to find a lawyer and pending their deportation proceedings. And so about half of the book actually takes place in Oakland, where they live, and where they're sort of trying to build a life as these teenagers with really teenage preoccupations, like girls and school and Facebook and what shoes they're gonna buy, and then with these really adult preoccupations, like we need lawyers. We're afraid we're gonna be killed. We're afraid our family's going to be killed back home. We owe a debt of $14,000 that at a certain point in the book is up to $22,000, even though they're paying every month. So they're sort of, balancing these lives, which is really common for young migrants of sort of, there's a lot being asked of them. That's my book. Yeah.
More questions?
Coming
Spoiler
away.
alert, Trump wins. That it does happen in my book.
Hi. Despite the increased interest in these stories, there's a narrative that I think is almost completely ignored. And that's, and you partly touched on it just in describing the horrible situations that cause people to have to migrate in the first place. But what's really missing is an understanding of U.S. government policy that has, backed some really bad things down there, and really, if not being the cause of it, being certainly exacerbating terrible situations. And I'm just thinking that part of the narrative would or might bring Americans around to an interest in, of responsibility of their government,
Right.
And maybe get at the cause of it rather than the effect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that could be a book unto itself. I think both of our books talk about that a fair amount. Although I think in mine, I certainly could have done more, but the legacy of violence, of intervention, of meddling, of propping up horrendous governments that perpetrated catastrophic human rights abuses against their citizens. I mean, gang violence is just an outgrowth of that. I mean, that's very clear. I guess I couldn't agree with you more when we hear this, and I hear this a lot around Thanksgiving tables, et cetera, that, why should this be our problem? Why should migration be our problem? And it's like, well, because we did help create that problem. And okay, that can be a historical fact when it comes to what's happened. My expertise is Central America. This is certainly true in Mexico, in the Mexican story as well, and Eileen covers it really well in her book. But it also makes me concerned not just about why should we care about immigration, but like our foreign policy, the foreign policy of today is causing it already is having ripple effects on the future that we can't even, that beyond our wildest nightmares, right? And that is what's really concerning to me too. Not just, yes, absolutely, sort of taking responsibility for the interventions of yore and what that's done to communities all over the world and how that's impacted migration, but also like what we're doing now matters in many years.
Yes. To me, a way that I found to make people feel that this concerns them, of course, if you give them that context, that as some immigrants say, we are here because you were there. Mm-hmm. We were in El Salvador, we were in several countries, and that's why now they're here. But to me, to tell the stories of dreamers has helped a lot, because we maybe don't feel related to people who are crossing the border right now, what you have to do with them. But if I tell you the story of a kid that grew up with your kids, that went to the school with your children, that is working in the coffee shop in the corner right now, that you know every day, and if I tell you why that family came here from El Salvador, from Mexico, from Honduras, you can start to feel that, yes, this concerns you. And if it doesn't touch you because it's a human rights or a social justice issue, at least it should concern you, because we have invested in these kids at least 12 years of education with our tax money, and if my money is there, I don't want them back in Mexico. I want them here you know, preparing, studying, because they are going to pay for my retirement, among other things. So to me, to realize that those stories happening in the border are already here in our neighborhoods, and we know those people, and telling the stories of these people that already live here is very helpful to connect to them. And that's why I insist so much in following up on stories, because that way you can make people realize that being American is not just about the document, but the society and the community that you belong to.
Question in the back.
I came because I wanted to understand the purpose of the book, and also to give my input about when I listen and listen the questions and the answers, and how insensitive can be to ask a person to prove a trauma, something that is like a lot of things that American people are asking to immigrants to prove are things that are there already. And I think that the right to stay home for immigrants is something that United States has harmed all the countries. And it's like people cannot stay because like they are running from all the exploitation and all the abuse that they're going, like when you're, like this system is a system of fear, because right now they, like the real purpose is not take the immigrants away, is that to make immigrants to be fear, to ask for what is just, what is like their rights, and it's not that they don't need the immigrants. Yes, they need the immigrants to be hired, because that way they will not be able to provide service. Like we never talk about the facts of where is the money that they're being taken from the immigrants' check for many centuries, and no one has asked for the facts. No one. I haven't heard a book about that, and it's like where is the when we're gonna be sensitive and have conversations about this? That's where is when, like when I hear about, like we are having conversations about immigrants, it's like, I haven't read the book, but it's like something like, what is, the question is there, like, what is the real problem? It's not about the immigrants, it's about something else, like the system.
It's the system.
Yeah. Agreed.
In the case of my book, I try to focus on stories of people which I describe as forced migration. Many of the people that I talked to, they didn't want to come to the US. One of these men, literally crying, told me, I don't want my children to live here, to stay here, because if I die, they will not be in their own land, in their own country. So it was so heavy for him to feel that he was forced to take his children away from their country. So I think that's the main focus of some of my stories. This is a forced migration. This is not people who wanted to come here. This is people who was forced to come here. And also about what you say, proving the trauma, it's not just people asking for that, judges are asking for that. And I mentioned that in the book as well. The case that I was mentioning before, this person, the position similar to a council member who had to flee because they were killing council members, the cartel is colluded with the police, with the authorities. That happens in many towns in Mexico. So the judge was asking for him to prove that he presented, I don't remember, some document to the authorities after the first threats. Of course, he cannot go back to Mexico, so he cannot get the document from the authorities. And this is a small town. So the judge asked him to call someone in the town to ask for the document and send it. And the judge don't understand that if someone goes there to ask for that, the authorities colluded with the cartels will know that this person is in touch with the other one, and that puts this person in risk. It's complex, but it's not that complex if you try to understand what the situation is. It's just not wanting to do it. I've heard cases where judges ask for, you cannot imagine. It's the most ridiculous things. recently I spoke with someone, and the judge was asking them to prove that Haiti suffered an earthquake. And he was asking for proof, newspaper, and it was like, this is ridiculous, this is ridiculous. So yes, it's not only people, it's also the authorities, and the system is being used to work that way in certain cases.
Any more questions from the House? Ian, do you have any other questions for our authors?
I think I'm tapped out.
Okay. In that case, I'd like to thank Eileen Truax and Lauren Markham and Ian Gordan for a very provocative and wonderful program, and our co-sponsors from Refugee Transitions. And also I want to make mention that Lauren's book just won 2 awards, one from the California Book Awards and also from the Northern California Book Awards. So we're very pleased and honored. And congratulations. And also, Eileen's book is very, very potent.
Wonderful.
And she's a wonderful journalist as well. And we are so pleased that we have a representation from Northern California and Southern California, where the issues of immigration and refugees is so potent, with San Francisco being a sanctuary city. Also, I've just found out that we have Maria and Manuel Maten from the Mexican consulate. We welcome you. Thank you for joining us tonight. And so I would also like to make a quick mention of another program on immigration. This is on Thursday at 12:30 with Vanessa Hua for her new book, A River of Stars, which is about a Chinese immigrant. So if you want to continue the immigrant stories,
Please do.
Please come 12:30 on Thursday, this Thursday, September 27th, and we will welcome you to our next event. So please thank our guests, and we will see you shortly. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
And now we have books for sale, We Build the Wall, and the Faraway Brothers for sale through City Lights Books and Publishing. Please join us.